Hey, welcome again to Wednesdays in the Word. Again, this is Dr. Stan, and we just are honored to be able to present you principles from the Word of God that hopefully you can apply to your life and make your day go a little bit better, especially in these crazy times. Hey, if you want to learn more about us, remember we're at vision.edu for those that want to study and really equip themselves for areas of leadership and ministry. We also have booksbyvision.org, all of our materials out there, and then drstandekoven.com if you just want to get a hold of me or learn some more about what I'm doing. Hey, we're going to talk now about leaders and their family life. When I was in the Army, I was told that if we wanted you to have a wife, we would have issued you one. Because a wife can, divide your priorities. You should only be focused on the military. Well, and some people, I think that, a pastor, if God wanted you to have a wife and kids and family and other issues related to that, well, then God would have issued you one. Because I've found that congregants sometimes believe that their pastor is their personal pastor, their guide to life, and they're to be there at their very beck and call. Well, that very concept of the idea that a pastor is on duty 24/7 is really one of the greatest stressors that we find in marriage and family life of those that are a part of the ministry, a part of church leadership. The demands, if you will, of the church are sometimes so strong that the family gets neglected. I remember a dear friend, Dr. John Delgado. His dad was a superintendent of a denomination in the New York area. And John used to teach a little introduction to pastoral theology. And he would start by saying, my father had an affair. And he would go on about this mistress and how beautiful she was, but how demanding she was. And he spent all the time with her. And of course, what he was talking about was the church. The church was the mistress, if you will, that got all of the positive and all the attention, and what everybody got at home was the grumpy old man. Well, we hear that so often, and certainly that's not what God intended for spiritual leaders in the church. And that's why I think, we need to recognize we have a call in our lives. We have a call to leadership, but at the same time, we have a primary responsibility to the family that God has placed us in. And none of us who are in spiritual leadership have done it perfectly. It doesn't exist. We've all made mistakes, and frankly, probably, most likely, our kids have been damaged to a certain extent because of our devotion to our ministries. Well, we find the same thing with anyone that's devoted to a certain career path and they're passionate about it. We find the same thing that usually happens in doctors' homes and lawyers' homes and CEOs of major businesses. Anyone that's relatively successful, you're going to get the same complaints. But we're supposed to be perfect, aren't we? I mean, we're pastors, we're spiritual leaders. But of course that doesn't exist. But we do need to be conscious, we need to be aware, and we need to be focused on, to a certain extent, making sure that the needs of our families are at least not neglected, if anything, that they're benefited because of your role in spiritual leadership. And so, it starts out, of course, if you're a single pastor, you have nothing to worry about except for the 2/3 of your congregation, which are female, that all believe they've heard from God to marry you. You said, that doesn't happen. Oh, yes, it does. But that's another story. If you are single and God's called you to celibacy, most likely you're not going to end up pastoring, at least not successfully. Be involved in other areas of ministry, but probably not pastoring. Because again, people look to their pastor as the ideal everything. But now, if you've gotten married, hopefully you've made a good selection on the husband or wife. One of the big problems we find in much spiritual leadership is a relationship that's not very good, and it wasn't advisable from day one. I remember back in the day, especially in the 1970s, people were so just waiting for the rapture to happen. So they either decided, I'm not going to get married, Or they got married quickly because I don't want to go to heaven, celibate. That would be horrible. And they made terrible decisions about who they should marry. So, one of the things that we should recognize is that, the selection of a spouse is very important. And the nurturing of that relationship becomes even more important if you haven't made the best selection. Because, again, I think heaven's viewpoint is simple. Maybe just before you got married, all of heaven would be screaming, "Don't do it!" But once you say, "I do," God says, make it work. Make the best out of it. Love your wife, honor your husband, etc. All of that becomes germane in our daily life. And so really, in terms of priorities, obviously our relationship with God is number one. The church, though, is not number two, and they're not necessarily the same thing. To love God doesn't mean serve the church. To love God means to love God. It's your personal relationship with the Lord. That is primary. Secondarily, love your wife, care for your kids, and then serve the Lord in the vocational calling in which He has given you. And so often the problems that we find in ministers' homes comes because those priorities are out of whack. You have to be able and willing to do what you can to take care of your family. I know a lot of pastors' wives, leaders' wives, they seem to have the raggediest clothes. They have the worst car, because it's all for Jesus. Well, again, you're married. If you're married, you've made a covenant agreement to take care of your spouse and your kids, and you should do it to the best of your ability. Now, again, I don't think any leader has to have dreams of being totally wealthy, but to be able to take care of your family well should be a part of your heart, and it should be a focus of your time and energy. And I've had many people say, "Yeah, but if I'm full-time with the church, then I only make so much." I said, well, maybe you have to supplement that income. That's a dialogue to have with your church leadership. If they can't take care of you properly, well, then you got to do something, because taking care of your family is not an option, it's an absolute. It's required. So as a husband, you need to love your wife. As a father or mother, you need to care for your children and raise them in the nurture and the admonition of the Lord. And so it's very helpful, and I found this to be helpful in life and ministry, is to have special times for your spouse, especially. For my wife and I, it was always usually Friday night, because that seemed to be the best night. So we had a date night, and we enjoyed that date night. With my kids, I would pick them up. I had some flexible time, so I would go get them at lunchtime, every other week or so, pick them up at school, take them out to McDonald's, make all their friends jealous. But do that just for the personal time and relationship. You build into it good rituals, birthdays and holidays, etc., and you want to make those things a priority. So listen, when you're thinking about leadership, leaders, you need to protect your family as well. And this is the last point I want to make on this is sometimes your kids and your spouse are almost in a fishbowl, and you need to do what you can to protect them. Because by far they are more important to you, but they're more important really, I think, in the kingdom than all the rest of the folks out there. Look, you have a responsibility, but you also have a privilege to love your kids, to love your spouse, and to see them fulfill, their life ambition as well. And so especially in public, you want to honor your spouse. You should provide good security for them, because remember, after it's all said and done, none of us are probably going to be dying in the pulpit. Well, at least we hope we don't, especially if we don't want to be shot or something like that. But most of us, we're going to eventually end our ministries in terms of the active phase of it. And we're going to still have our family left. And what we want to be able to have is an intact, healthy, loving, caring family. Not perfect, doesn't exist, but a family that they can look back and say, they did their best, and we had a good life together, because we knew the most important thing was that we were loved, that we were valued, even above the vocation that mom or dad had. Hey, we're going to talk more about this leadership in the church in our next session.